Now, I've got a sneaky feeling that you like turbos, and we're talking about them today just for you guys because I get this question a lot. Should I get the journal bearing? Should I get the ball bearing? What are the differences? What are the advantages? Is it worth the extra money? Because trust me, there's quite the price difference in between turbo models. So that's what we're gonna do. Let's talk about the stuff today. So you're really gonna run into only a couple different types of turbos out on the market whenever you're trying to buy one, either journal bearing or ball bearing. Now, yeah, there probably are some weird ones out there. You can get like the comp oilless one, a whole bunch of, we're not gonna get into that stuff today. We're sticking to the basics, okay? We're talking about turbos. Now, before we get into the key identifier of how you can tell like a journal bearing between a ball bearing apart, let's first talk about turbo components, because if you don't know, there's three main sections that make up a turbo. On this one, this is a stock VF48 out of well, it's a brand new VF48 that goes in an STI. You've got the exhaust housing on this side, you've got the compressor housing on this side, you've got the center cartridge, or commonly referred to as the CHRA. Now, this one here is a journal bearing. Now, if you didn't know that, or if you couldn't tell that stock turbos for Subarus are journal bearing, what you can do is look at the center cartridge here. As you can see, the center cartridge itself is just kind of smooth. There's no veins, no ribs or anything like that. So that's one big key identifier to being able to tell apart a journal bearing from a ball bearing. Now, if I grab my ball bearing turbo for the STI, which forgive me if I can't hold this for very long because it's a little heavy, you can see on the center cartridge right there, you see those fins? Those are additional cooling fins built into a ball bearing turbo. Jesus, dude. So with these ones, that makes it a lot easier to hold. With these ones, you're able to identify that it is a ball bearing turbo based off of that center cartridge right there. If it has these cooling fins, it's more than likely going to be a ball bearing turbo versus not having them journal bearing. Now, one thing with turbos, if you're going to buy a turbo for your car, say it's a 6466, say it's a 6062, say it's a 5858, whatever size turbo you're looking at, there's more than likely going to be a counterpart of that turbo for journal bearing or ball bearing for that same turbo. Now, you're probably going to see a massive price difference between that ball bearing and that journal bearing. That's for a couple different reasons. The journal bearing itself is a little bit easier. It's a little bit cheaper to manufacture. We're going to get into like the key differences. I'm not going to go too much into it right now, but you're probably going to see a comparable turbo in a journal bearing model. Now, keep in mind, the ball bearing model is not going to make any more power than the journal bearing would. They're going to make the exact same power, but the key difference is they're going to make that power a little bit differently. Now, with ball bearing turbos, because they're, if you do, I can show you a ball bearing. Who skateboards? Skateboard wheels? Yeah, these are Bone Swiss, baby. Bone Swiss. These are ball bearings. Ball bearings, they're exactly what they sound like. It's a small cartridge with a whole bunch of steel balls in there that ride on each other that allow things to spin a lot more freely than a journal bearing would. Journal bearings use a whole assembly of components to be able to function properly. They've got a thrust washer, thrust bearing, a whole bunch of stuff in there. In theory, everything should ride on a thin film of oil inside of that turbo, and you should never have metal to metal contact in any aspect of any turbocharger. Now, I talked about this a minute ago. One of the differences between ball bearing and journal bearing of the exact same models is how the power comes on. Now, with a ball bearing turbo, you're gonna see quicker spool characteristics of that turbo. So if you are looking for something that's gonna spool a little bit quicker, maybe 500 to 700 RPM a little bit quicker, a ball bearing model turbo will get you there, just that little extra kick. Now, there's two other main differences between these two turbos here. With the journal bearing turbos require a lot more oil than a ball bearing would. You will probably never, if very rarely, ever see any type of oil restrictor on a journal bearing turbo. That's because journal bearing turbos, they love oil. They need oil to survive. They thrive on oil. Ball bearing turbos are a little bit different. If you over supply oil to a ball bearing turbo, you get smoking, you can over lubricate it, you're gonna get too much oil going through there, you can backfeed it. It's going to probably smoke though. That's probably gonna be your biggest indication that you're feeding too much oil into that ball bearing turbo. Now, with precision turbos here, I need an easier way to hold this. With precision turbos here, right under this little orange tag right there is a little nut. And on that nut is actually how the bearings inside are all located. It's an oil feed locating pin. Now, with most of them, they don't have any type of oil restriction added onto those pins, so you're gonna either have to find the restriction. I'm gonna set this down, dude. You're gonna need to figure out the type of oil restriction you're gonna need for that turbo, because it is going to vary from application to application based off of oil pressure your car is producing. For us in this STI, with our old 6870 and with this 7675, we are going to be running an oil restrictor. It's not really, it's more of an oil pressure regulator from TurboSmart. It just drops the oil pressure down to about 40 PSI and gives just the right amount of oil for that center cartridge to be able to stay lubricated and get the oil out of the drain. Another big advantage to the ball bearing turbo is there's a lot less, well, there's not a lot less moving parts, but there's less moving parts. Less moving parts means less things to fail, which is what we like. We don't like failures. Don't like failures, especially turbos. Turbos get expensive. Now, one thing between the journal bearing and the ball bearing is that there are some shaft speed limitations on ball bearing turbos that journal bearings are a little bit more forgiving on, so do keep that in mind. If it's something that you're gonna be absolutely abusing the car all the time, probably gear more towards journal bearing. And let me say right now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with journal bearing or ball bearing for whatever it may be. Different applications for different settings. For most street cars out there, a journal bearing turbo is gonna be more than enough for what you need. And like I said, there's going to be a significant difference in price between a journal bearing turbo and a ball bearing turbo. It's because journal bearing turbos, cheaper to manufacture, cheaper to build, you can rebuild them a little bit easier, they're not too bad in price. Once you start comparing that over to ball bearing turbos, that's where you're gonna see a massive price increase. You may see sometimes double to 2.5 times the cost from a journal bearing model over to a ball bearing model. Now on the bright side for you, if you're someone who likes to DIY all your own stuff, these are pretty rebuildable. They have rebuild kits for journal bearing turbos. You can do it at home most of the time. Ball bearing turbos are a little bit of a different story. Sometimes you do need to send those into Precision, Garrett, whoever you're buying them from, to get a rebuild done on them. Like I said, there is that oil shaft locating pin for the ball bearings inside of that turbo, which you don't want to misalign, because then you can damage the bearings. Then you're going to be sending it right back in for another rebuild. So journal bearings, a little bit easier to service, especially if you're somebody who likes to do all of your own services and save a little bit of money. Additional nice thing about, okay, so we're going to talk about these. This turbo uses coolant, okay? That big 7675 right there I have does not use coolant. That's actually a key factor in a couple things that we're gonna get into. Now, lubrication, fluids, anything that flows through a turbo is going to extract heat from it. As it extracts heat from it, it keeps the center cartridge cooler, which is what you want. You don't want to overheat a center cartridge. Now, with one that's water cooled, it helps prevent oil coking. If you don't know what oil coking is, think about like you have a frying pan, right? And you put a whole bunch of like butter in there and you just left the stove on high and you just left it there. All that butter that you just put in the pan is going to burn. It's going to get stuck to the pan. If you continue to do that over time, you're just going to build up more crud inside of that pan. Think of a turbo as the same way. If you don't have any way to extract heat out of the turbo, you're just going to be cooking oil in there. Now it's only going to start cooking oil in there, and I told myself I wasn't even going to bring up turbo timers, but I'm going to bring up a turbo timer for a minute. That's the whole point of a turbo timer, is to help prevent oil coking in turbos. So if you just went out and you did like a spirited, I'm gonna put this down for a minute. Actually, you know what? It's just fun to shake around. Now, if you just go out and you beat on your turbo, okay? You beat on your car, it's nice and hot, and you just did like a spirited drive, you just did a track event, you just did whatever. If you just shut that car off immediately, what's gonna happen? All that oil is going to stop flowing through that turbo because the oil pump isn't pushing oil through the engine anymore, and obviously through oil galleys and oil feeds. Now, if you just shut it off when hot, the oil that is in here, that's where oil coking comes in. That's what oil coking is. You're gonna start building up a whole bunch of crud inside of the center cartridge of the turbo. And the more you do that, the less it's going to, well, it's going to reduce the lifespan of the turbo, in short. Now, isn't so much applicable with like a water-cooled turbo, because that's the whole point of water cooling, is to help with oil coking. Oil coking plays a factor in the big boys like this. When you don't have, well, it's not even all big boys, but oil coking plays more of a factor in something like this. There are no water lines that go to this thing. So this turbo is only cooled by oil flowing through it. So if we go out with the STI, we go do a whole bunch of dyno pulls, we go beat on the car a whole bunch, and then we just shut the car off immediately, what's gonna happen? Ball bearings are a little bit fragile. It's gonna start oil coking the center cartridge of that turbo. And the more I do that, the shorter it's gonna reduce the lifespan of the turbo. Like I said, that's where turbo timers come in. I don't like turbo timers. I've never been a fan of a turbo timer. Just let your car idle. If you're out at the track, just let it idle down for like 5 minutes. It's not that big of a deal. Shaft play. Let's talk about the shaft a little bit, okay? We're gonna dingle the balls, we're gonna play with the shaft. Now, with shaft play, we have our friendly, nice little, I feel like I'm holding like a turbo cannon. Now with shaft play on a turbo, you're gonna have a little bit of side-to-side play. That's totally normal. Once this pressurizes with oil, that CHRA is gonna tighten up that shaft a little bit. It's gonna fill up some of those negative spaces with that oil film. Obviously, for the love of God, don't stick your finger inside of a spinning turbo to feel if it has shaft play while the car is running. Don't do that, don't be stupid. Now, what dangerous or bad shaft play is with a turbo is axial. If you don't know what axial is, it's in and out shaft play. So it'd be the shaft of the turbo moving in and outwards from the compressor housing to the exhaust housing. That is what bad shaft play is. That means your thrust washer, your thrust bearing, all of that stuff is starting to wear, which would in turn mean that your turbo needs a rebuild. Now, obviously, if you have side-to-side shaft play and it's touching the actual turbine is touching the wall of the compressor housing or the exhaust housing, that's obviously another sign that it needs to be replaced. But most of the time people will have a little bit of left to right play in a turbo. It's totally fine. A lot of people that buy brand new turbos, if they don't know a lot about them, they see that little bit of play and they're like, I got a bad turbo right off the shelf. No, you didn't. It's totally normal, I promise. Now, with my ball bearing turbo here in the turbo cannon, I don't know how well it's gonna pick up on camera, but as I move this shaft side to side, it gets incredibly close to the actual compressor housing of the turbo. Now that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that once this sees oil pressure, it's gonna tighten up those tolerances and it's not going to touch. If it is touching, like I said, that's a sign your turbo needs a rebuild anyways, but you're not gonna have that on a brand new turbo unless you bought like a cheap Chinese one, then it's hit or miss there. Don't buy cheap Chinese turbo. In short, if you should buy a journal bearing, if you should buy a ball bearing, if it's a street car, if it's a spirited driving car, if it's a car you just like to have fun with, just buy the journal bearing, okay? You're not gonna see an incredible difference. You'll see a difference between a ball bearing and a journal bearing, don't get me wrong, but for most street cars, 95% of them, a journal bearing is just fine. I run a journal bearing FP Red on the Evo. I ran a journal bearing 62 on the STI. The only reason I run a ball bearing turbo in this car is because that turbo is so large. I'm trying to help mitigate where it spools. In short, that's all I got for you guys on this one. If you're looking at buying a turbo, there's literally journal bearing turbo for street cars, 100%. Save yourself the extra money. Save yourself the extra $1,500, $2,000. Okay, journal bearing turbos are just fine. I use them on all my street cars. I know a lot of people that use them. They can take a beating also. Journal bearings are not as fragile as ball bearing turbos. Ball bearing turbos, if you overspin that shaft speed or you get outside of the boundaries of the limitations of that shaft speed of that turbo, you will literally explode your turbo. Okay, don't explode your turbo. Pick the turbo for your application. Like I said, journal bearings, they're cheaper, they're gonna take more abuse, they're easier to service. Journal bearings are just a little bit easier in general than ball bearings, but like I said, there's no right or wrong choice for whatever one you're looking at. So that's all I got for you guys on this one. If there's anything that I missed regarding both of these turbos, feel free, ask down below in the comments. I will try my best to answer it. If not, I'm sure some other people can jump in and help also. But if you guys liked the video, you know what to do. Go ahead and hit that like button, turn it black, blue, green, yellow, purple, silver sign, whatever color it turns for you. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you wanna be one of these corners, no idea which one I'll put it in quite yet, but with that, I will catch you guys in the next one. So peace out, homies.